Okay, so have you ever, like, really sat back and thought about how the words we use, they might actually be changing meaning,
Yeah.
like, right in front of us?
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Right. And we're not just talking about, like, slang going in and out of style, but, like, core concepts,
Hmm.
the stuff that really shapes how we see the world.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what makes this new research paper so fascinating, the one we're diving into today.
They took a massive data set, 1.5 million tweets, all to see if the language used by, the political left and right here in the U.S. is actually diverging.
It's a really ambitious study. They wanted to figure out if words like, say, freedom or even justice could actually mean different things to different people depending on their political leanings.
So we're talking about, like, is your definition of justice totally different from mine if we're on opposite sides of the political spectrum?
That's the big question. And to get at that, they didn't just look at any random tweets. They focused specifically on how people use language in their own little online bubbles.
Online bubbles, you mean like echo chambers?
Exactly. The researchers analyzed tweets from users who exclusively followed either left-leaning or right-leaning news outlets. They used the All Sides media bias rankings to define what counts as left or right-leaning, by the way.
So it's not a perfect measure of someone's political views, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what kind of information they're consuming on a regular basis.
Right. And by analyzing millions of tweets from these users, they could start to see if there were patterns in how each group used language. Like, are there statistically significant differences in the words they use, the topics they talk about, even the emotions they express?
So it's not just about looking at individual tweets in isolation. It's about looking at the bigger picture of how language is being used in these different online ecosystems.
Exactly.
So did they just find, like, the usual suspects, red words versus blue words, or was there something deeper going on?
Well, they did find some really stark differences, even just in how often certain words popped up. Like, right-leaning accounts use names like Biden and Fauci way more often.
Interesting. And probably not in a good way, I'm guessing.
Yeah, a lot of the time it was negative. But on the flip side, left-leaning accounts used way more emojis overall.
Huh. So it's not necessarily that everyone on the right is sitting there ranting about Biden all day long.
Right, exactly. It's more nuanced than that. The study actually suggests that some of these really strong frequency differences, they might be amplified by a smaller but more vocal group of users.
Ah, so a few loud voices can really skew the data. Did they find any evidence that one side was just, like, using more negative language overall?
Interestingly enough, yeah, their analysis showed that tweets from right-leaning accounts tended to be a bit more negative in tone. But, and this is super important, that finding by itself doesn't mean people on the right are just inherently more negative people.
Right. Context is everything.
Exactly. There's actually a lot of research out there showing that negativity can be a really powerful tool, especially in politics, for grabbing attention.
Oh, absolutely. Like, a shocking headline is going to get more clicks than a neutral one, right?
Exactly. So it could be that the online spaces these users are in, the information they're seeing, maybe it encourages that kind of language. It's complicated.
It's like a vicious cycle, maybe. But, okay, so we've talked about the words themselves, but what about the meaning behind them? Did the study actually find evidence that these two groups were using words to mean different things? Like, is the word freedom becoming something different depending on your political views?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. They used some pretty high-tech AI techniques, the kind that analyzes how words are used in different contexts to actually see if their meanings are shifting. And they found some potential candidates, words that seem to be diverging.
No way. Okay, so tell me more. How did they verify that? You can't just trust AI blindly, right?
Oh, absolutely not. To double check what the AI was finding, they took those potentially diverging words and they ran a separate analysis using human annotators. Basically, they showed people pairs of tweets containing the word and asked them, okay, how similar or different are the meanings of this word in these two tweets?
So it was like human versus machine, meaning showdown. What happened?
Exactly. And the results were fascinating. For some words, like the crying with tears emoji, both the left and right-leaning users seem to be using it in pretty similar ways.
Interesting. So some things translate, but others don't.
Right. And that's where we get to some of the most thought-provoking findings from this whole study. Words like woke and vet, for instance, they showed clear signs of having different meanings depending on who was using them.
Oh, yeah, you can see that playing out everywhere, not just on Twitter. Woke has become such a loaded term, right? Depending on who's saying it. It can be a compliment, an insult, a whole political statement.
Yeah.
And then vet, I mean, are we talking about a military veteran or someone who takes care of your cat? Two totally different meanings.
Precisely. And that's where these seemingly subtle linguistic shifts become really important for all of us.
Because if we're not even speaking the same language, like figuratively, how can we even begin to bridge those divides in the real world, you know?
It's such a crucial point. And this isn't just about semantics or anything. It's about how these linguistic differences, they can actually lead to real misunderstandings, misinterpretations even.
Oh, totally, yeah.
It can even lead to conflict. Think about how often you see those political debates, and they just devolve into arguments about what a word really means.
Ugh, it's exhausting. So, what's the takeaway here? I feel like this research is pointing to something way bigger than just how people use Twitter, right?
We're 100%. The big takeaway here is that language, it's alive. It's constantly evolving, changing, adapting.
Right.
And sometimes those changes, they can actually reflect some pretty deep societal shifts, divisions even.
So it's like a canary in a coal mine almost.
Yeah, exactly.
If the language is changing, there's probably something bigger going on beneath the surface.
Precisely. But instead of just throwing up our hands and saying, well, we're doomed, we can actually use this knowledge to become more mindful about how we communicate.
I like that. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we become more mindful communicators in a world where words seem to be changing meaning all the time?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, right? Being conscious of the fact that the words we use, even really simple ones, they can be interpreted in totally different ways.
Yeah.
It depends on who you're talking to. And that also means being willing to step outside of our own echo chambers, both online and offline.
So less doom scrolling, more actually talking to people who challenge our views.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's in those conversations, those sometimes uncomfortable encounters with different perspectives, that we actually start to understand the nuances of language, how it's being used, and how our own understanding of a word might not be the only one.
Yeah.
It might not even be the most accurate one.
It's a humbling thought, but an important one. It reminds me of that quote. I can't remember who said it, but it's the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Oh, that's a good one. And that is so true, especially now, right? And we're constantly bombarded with information from every direction.
Yeah, information overload.
It's easy to get caught in your own bubble and just assume everyone sees the world the same way you do.
Yeah.
But this research is showing us that might not be the case at all.
So where do we go from here? This all feels very big picture. What can I, as a person, actually do in my own life to be a more mindful communicator? Besides maybe spending a little less time on Twitter.
Well, like we were saying, awareness is a huge first step, right? Just paying attention to the words you use, especially in those conversations where things are getting a little heated. But beyond that, maybe think about your linguistic diet.
My linguistic diet? Is that only reading dictionaries now?
No, not quite. Think of it more like diversifying your information sources. Because if you're only ever exposed to one viewpoint, one set of opinions all the time, you're going to have a really limited understanding of how language is actually being used out in the world.
So it's about branching out, getting different perspectives on language itself.
Exactly. So make an effort to seek out different voices, read articles or watch documentaries from people who hold different views than your own. And have those kind of awkward but important conversations with people who see things differently.
So it's about expanding our understanding of how language works, basically. How it can both unite us and divide us.
Yes. And recognizing that even when we're using the same words, they might carry different weights, different histories, even different emotional baggage, depending on, who's speaking and who's listening. We need to be aware of those subtleties.
This has been fascinating, but I have to ask, did the study have any, final thoughts on what this all means? Are we doomed to speak totally different languages forever?
Not necessarily, no. They emphasize that even though they are seeing these signs of divergence, American English is still largely intelligible within, its speech community. We're not quite at the point of needing separate dictionaries or anything.
Okay, that's reassuring, I guess.
But it is a good reminder that language is dynamic, right? And it's being shaped by how we use it, both consciously and unconsciously. If we're not careful, these really subtle shifts in meaning can become magnified. And then that leads to even bigger misunderstandings and divisions down the line.
So it's like a call to action almost. We need to be more aware of the power of language
Yeah,
and really use it thoughtfully.
absolutely.
And never stop questioning what words really mean, even the ones we think we know.
I love that. And on that note, here's something to think about. What if they did this study again?
Okay.
In 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What do you think those results would look like?
Oh, wow.
Would the language have diverged even more, or could we actually see things start to shift back in the other direction?
Now, that is a question I would love to see answered. It feels like this research, it's giving us a glimpse into something much, much bigger than just, politics or Twitter or whatever.
Oh, for sure.
It's about how we even understand each other as human beings.
100%. These questions about meaning and interpretation and how we use language, they're not new. They've been around forever. They're at the heart of how we connect with each other, build communities, even just navigate the world around us.
It makes you realize how important it is to really be mindful, not just of what you're saying, but also how it might be heard by someone else, and to always try to be as clear and understanding as possible, especially when we're communicating with people who might see things differently than we do.
Beautifully said. Because ultimately, language, it has the power to both bring us together and tear us apart. It's up to us to choose how we use it.
That is a powerful thought to end on. This deep dive has given us all a lot to think about, especially when it comes to language, how it's changing, and what that means for all of us. Until next time, everyone, keep those linguistic diets balanced. And remember, communication is a two-way street. So let's all try to listen to each other.
Yeah.